discussions to the Roundtable. And just for information, we're only recording the first half an hour when the speakers are speaking, and then after that it's not recording, it's a live stream on Facebook. We have many people that are following, so welcome again everyone. So we have Andrew Bollington. He's the Managing Director of Via Aid, a consultancy that helps foundations with an education focus to increase their impact. Connie Chung is a researcher and former high school teacher. She works with many organizations in education on helping them with research, policy, and practice. And Sara Monteaebaro is the senior officer for Solve Learning Community at MIT. She works to cultivate a robust community of innovators, cross-sector leaders, and change makers dedicated to improve the quality of education and improve learning outcomes. So we'll start with Andrew and Connie and then Sara. So Andrew, over to you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm a thorough believer that the best dialogues and discussions at conferences happen when people don't speak for too long at the front and then allow time for it. And then I've observed that, of course, at the moment the microphone's in front of me and I'm in the point of control, there's this temptation to say, right, I will fill this. So I really am going to keep this deliberately quite short, and it's because I value the conversation more than hearing my own words. We were posed a number of questions, and I decided to address one of them directly on. It's the question of which areas of learning should we explore during the school's 2030 research programme and how I need to do so. And I'm not an academic and I'm not a politician, so I'm capable of giving a straight answer to what I think is a fairly simple question by saying, actually, there's three things, because there's always three things, aren't there? The three things that I think, when it comes to uncertainty, really deserve to be looked at, understood, tracked, and to use the 2030. I'll answer the question in a moment. In the paper I wrote, I used the analogy of a vaccine. The idea that actually, if you've got a problem, if you've got a disease or something, maybe counterintuitively, if you put yourself back into the 18th century, I'm sure it wasn't obvious that actually injecting people with a modified version of the same thing might actually help to get the body in a position where it recognises it and can fight against it. I'm sure if you were first in that line in the 1800s for a vaccine, that was a bit of an act of faith. But actually, of course, we know it's saved hundreds of millions of lives since. So the question I asked myself was, well, is there a vaccine for uncertainty? We can't eradicate uncertainty. We probably don't want to eradicate uncertainty. But if my body is going to be prepared to deal with uncertainty, what might be the things that need to be triggered? So my vaccine, yet to be tested and available on the National Health Service, contains three things. The first is a dose of risk-taking. The second is a dose of self-regulation, and the third is a dose of resilience. And I'll explain the rationale and the logic for each of those as I go through. But first of all, risk-taking. Risk-taking has been defined as the intentional interaction with uncertainty. In other words, it's a decision to engage with uncertainty, not a random decision. I'm sure someone could characterise what I'm about to say as being reckless and careless, and he doesn't care about health and safety, and he wants to see people taking unnecessary risks and so on. And I want to be careful of saying, no, this is the intentional interaction with uncertainty. I think health and safety and safeguarding of children and all of those kind of things is as important as ever. But if there aren't opportunities in our lives, but particularly in the younger part of our lives, when we can intentionally interact with uncertainty, where we can take risks, we can make judgments about that, we can decide what we're going to do, then I don't think we learn how to deal with risk. And if we don't know how to deal with risk, we don't know how to deal with uncertainty. And so I think education systems need to incorporate that element of risk-taking. Several of us in the room have an IB background. The IB is interesting in the sense that it has a learner profile which actually highlights risk-taking as a characteristic to be developed. In other words, this isn't a negative thing. It's actually quite a positive thing with positive characteristics. I think you can go back to the younger stage of early childhood. I asked the question in the paper, could you learn to walk if someone removed the risk of falling over? I'm still struggling with that one. Would it be possible? Can you learn empathy if you don't have an experience of seeing another child fall over and cut their knee and need a sticking plaster put on it? I think I'm in favour of cut knees in kindergarten. I think that's actually part of the experience, and that actually yes, that means that child took a risk. If I had a health and safety hat on, I might condemn it. But actually, I think that's part of growing up. I think seeing how children behave, how they interact with each other, how they look after each other when one has had a scrape or a scratch, this is a positive thing. So I think that risk-taking starts in small ways, but needs to develop. Because let's face it, by the time kids get to the age of being an adolescent, the risks they're taking are much more serious. They're deciding whether they're going to smoke, whether they're going to take drugs, whether they're going to join a gang. And now risk-taking takes on a whole different element. Again, if you've had the helicopter parent, if you've had the school environment that totally protects the child, and the first serious risk they get to gamble on just when that prefrontal cortex is going a bit crazy and all those kind of things during adolescence, is a decision about gang membership or trying out a drug. Maybe they needed a bit of my antidote a few years earlier so they could practice the risk-taking on a few things that actually mattered less. So that's risk-taking. Second is self-regulation, because it's all well and good to say calculated risks, but if you don't have the inhibitory control, if you don't have the self-regulation to say, let's pause, let's just think through the consequences of what I'm about to do. Again, this is the prefrontal cortex part of the brain we heard about yesterday. If there's not that moment in order to make this, then the risk-taking is going to be not a intentional interaction, it's going to be a spontaneous interaction with risk. And again, in the adolescent brain, we know that often turns into, wow, that looks like fun. And they're off because they haven't paused and thought about it. And again, if we go back to the early years, which is my particular interest, we've got so much evidence now that shows how inhibitory control, self-regulation, part of that executive function package we were talking about, we can see how that correlates to so many life outcomes. And at first people look surprised when you say, actually, it correlates to your likelihood of having been arrested. Correlates with your likelihood of having been arrested at age 25, and people say, really? And yet, actually think it back, track it back. What's going on here? That ability to self-regulate, to think through the consequences of that spontaneous, silly act, to pause and maybe consider something else. That's ultimately probably the kind of thing that keeps you out of trouble with the criminal system. So I think self-regulation and risk-taking go together. One can't really operate without the other. And then my third one is resilience, because the truth of the matter is, if you take risks, occasionally it's going to go wrong. And of course, plenty of kids grow up in an environment where it went wrong anyway, as far as they're concerned, long before they made their decisions about it. I think we see increasing evidence that resilience, again, is a set of skills that can be developed. We can help children develop resilience. And by resilience, I mean, it's the ability to adapt well in a situation of trauma or threat or significant difficulty. We know the difference between the kids who have a problem but actually manage to get up the next day, get back in there and have another go. And I think resilience is a critical element there, because if you take a risk and you fail and that's it, you've got nowhere. But if you take a risk, you fail and you say, actually, I learned something from that. It wasn't great, I don't want to do it again, but I'm going to try again. You're onto a virtuous circle. I'm going to finish just by a very quick observation that I think the challenge we've got is that schools are becoming risk-free zones. Or we're trying to make schools risk-free zones. And, it's a combination of a lot of things. I think in countries like the UK, it's easy to blame the health and safety culture, and I'm sure that's a bit of it. But I think there are many things that are coming together, which, there was an article in yesterday's Times about the impact of helicopter parents, effectively removing this risk that their children delivering to them the school gates, because walking to school is far too dangerous, and we couldn't allow that. I think there are a series of things that mean that children aren't getting the opportunity to experiment with risk, and I mean that in that kind of conscious, planned way, to develop the self-regulation and to develop the resilience when something doesn't go quite as right. And the challenge I've got, and I think is well worth thinking about schools 2030, is not just can we look at risk-taking, self-regulation, resilience, and how we measure that, but also can we find ways of actually making schools more risky. That's what I wanted to say.
Thank you so much, Andrew. I think that was a very good start of the conversation. Hopefully in our discussion we could really think through then what does it really mean for teachers.
And how long did I take?
teachers, educators, and you just did less than 10 minutes. So, yeah, so hopefully we'll get to the conversation and really talk what does this mean for teachers and educators, and thank you.
Could I have the laptop, please? So I had some images that I wanted to show, so I'm going to do a little bit of a PowerPoint. I would love it if you would think back to the year of 1992, which, if you can imagine, in this age of rapid change, there was no internet, or maybe there was, but it was not widely used, and I don't think at that time there was even email. Our media consumption was mostly through TV. And I was a high school student at that point, studying U.S. history. It was in an AP U.S. history class. It was April. We were, down to a few weeks left before the AP exam, so we were, reviewing all the materials. And I turned on the TV at home, and this is the image that I basically saw. Let me see if I can see. Look at the. Okay, here we go. So that's what I saw when I turned on TV in 1992. So it was the Rodney King jury verdict. So 4 white officers were acquitted of beating a black man in a pretty bad condition. And the public reaction outside of LA, where the trial took place, was rioting and fires for 3 days straight. The National Guard came in, and I was just trying to make sense of what am I learning in U.S. history with what is happening 20 minutes down the road. And yes, we talked about it in passing, but why am I not having a greater understanding of why this happened? And more importantly, how do we make sure that this doesn't happen again, or reduce the chances of happening again? And then about a year ago, in the US, I just read a story about a 13-year-old girl whose father was arrested as she was making her way to school by ICE agents. And in that story, this young girl named Fatima said, rather than heading back home in silence, she and her family went to school anyway. I knew that we would be supported there. And it just kind of touched me in a way as a former teacher to say, regardless of whatever your political beliefs about immigration policies in the United States, here was a young woman who was hit with some uncertain happenings on her way to school, of all places. Yet she saw school as a place where she was supported and knew that what she would get would be some certainty around the adults who supported her. So I guess I just want to open it by saying, when we're talking about this question of uncertainty and schools, this notion that somehow schools have to bring in something may not be the right way to start, that actually, in fact, as in my case or in Fatima's case, they bring their experiences, either what they experience or what they see on TV, to schools with them. And given that that's what's happening, especially in right now in 2018, with not just TV, but with social media and Twitter and Facebook, and how what's happening in the world is just in our young people's faces every day, then what is the role of school? How do you help as adults to help young people not only make sense of what's happening, but also to actually do something about it? Because I think one of the worst places to be is to feel a lot of empathy towards some of the things that are happening in the world, but have absolutely no knowledge about how to do something about it, and you really lose that agency. So for this roundtable, we were asked with 3 questions. What's the role of teachers in equipping learners? I just try to answer that a little bit at the beginning with support. What might we expect of teaching as divisions to increase rather than recede, and then what areas of learning should we explore? So with the second question, I've been thinking about it, and when I became a teacher about 15, 20 years ago, that was one of the key drivers of what I wanted to learn to be a teacher. Even though I was not necessarily taught that way, how do I become a teacher who would be able to help young people navigate those kinds of realities? And so Facing History and Ourselves in the United States has been around for 25 years, and I think they were quite pivotal in partnering with me to bring some curriculum to the table for students. And I think just in general, for teachers partnering with organizations like To Teach a Man to Fish, or these other organizations that we heard about at this conference, who are very good at particular ways of engaging students to the world, and that the teacher's job would be to kind of integrate that kind of knowledge in their classrooms would be one way that I would think would be a relatively low lift for teachers who are asked to do so much already. So that's kind of a general proposal that I have. And then as I was teaching students, and then as a researcher, looking at the research around what's been done. So 4 ideas. 1, pair problems with possibilities. So as young people encounter problems, it can get pretty depressing, even as adults, right? And so provide some examples of social entrepreneurs, of leaders, political and otherwise, who are able to kind of identify a problem, lead other people to kind of solve it, to give young people hope, along with some of the data. So Scott Sider is a professor at BU who's done some research on this idea, and he found that especially with students from a privileged background, if you just dump them, with data about, what the illiteracy rate is or what the poverty rate is, they just tend to disengage and it's too overwhelming. But if you pair that with some possible hopeful examples, it's a better lift for students. That's number 1. Number 2, we already heard a little bit this morning about identity, but also researchers Suarez Orozco and others, especially in studying geographic areas where there's high rate of immigration, really saw that even for the population that was already there, the development of their identity was really important in kind of enabling a healthier integration of people from different backgrounds. So not just the identity of the people who are in the minority population, but actually the identity of the people who are in the majority population is really, really helpful. And with identity comes some confidence and certainty, but to also pair that with this inquiry-based mindset of asking questions, of not becoming arrogant, of really, figuring out there's a lot more in the world that I need to learn. That's as a disposition would be number 2, and then pair powerful knowing with powerful acting with others. So it's nice to know a lot about facts and figures, but to actually do something. So I've done some research on interfaith community organizing, and one of the findings that I saw that was kind of counterintuitive was. Not that they did, when I asked the respondents, like, what enabled you to kind of get along with people who are from different backgrounds from you? And that was not just religion, but also socioeconomic and even geographic backgrounds. And they said, actually, we've all been involved in lots and lots of interfaith dialogue where we talk about our different holidays and talk about our differences and similarities. And that really was not as impactful as joining together, figuring out a problem that we all face together in a community, let's say healthcare or education, and then figuring out a way to act on it. And the acting and the multiple events that took place built some trust, because I really needed to count on my fellow organizers who were in this group to really show up for me when we were addressing a problem that was important to me. So the knowing and the dialoguing is nice, but at some point, the acting, it was really helpful in terms of bringing people together from different backgrounds. And then kind of going back to number 1, pairing hope with criticality. So it's easy for teenagers, especially, I think, to be really critical, but to pair hope with that. And this afternoon, when we hear from the team from the Douglas High School after the shooting, I think one of the things that really struck me as a person who lived in the United States and saw that whole thing unfold with the shooting, but also the aftermath of how much the youth were engaged and organized, how much the teachers were accompanying them in that process. They had not only prepared them, they hadn't necessarily prepared them for this particular incident, but it was, from what I heard, the U.S. government teacher who had kind of taught them about how does our political system work? Why does this happen? What are special interest groups? How do they operate? And the students were able to take that knowledge and put some creativity and action into meeting a event that none of them probably could ever have foresawn. But at some point, the knowledge that their teachers had invested in them had kind of sunk in, and they were able to kind of catalyze that into action. And I think to not underestimate the importance of, again, having that kind of foundational knowledge about how things operate, and on that build this kind of a creative response. So I think I'll just end there.
Thank you. Great. Yeah.
So
Very good. And we'll put this Sara.
Sure.
Yes.
thank you both so much. This is actually really helpful to hear such diverse perspectives. This is what I love so much about these sort of collaborative discussions, is being able to meet people who are coming at the same issue from very different perspectives. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we do at MIT Solve. We're fairly new, so I have a feeling most people in the room don't know anything about us, but we are an initiative of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. our current president, Raphael Reif, thought of Solve really as a response to the innovation that was happening on the MIT campus. We're known as one of the world's leading research universities as driving innovation, but we also know that talent and ingenuity exists everywhere, not just in the hallways of MIT, not just for those who have an MIT ID card. And so Solve was really started in response to that we have to tap into that talent and ingenuity, find those innovators, find those what we call solvers around the world, and make sure that we are transferring that knowledge back to campus and bringing the resources that MIT has to them. So that's what Solve does. We're a matchmaker. We build bridges to connect social innovators from around the world who are working to solve some of the world's most complex issues within health, sustainability, economic prosperity, and learning. And this year we're focused on a challenge particularly around supporting teachers and educators. And that's how I'm going to sort of segue into what we're talking about today in this room. And I'll tell you a little bit more about the challenge in a moment. But I first want to, if you'll indulge me, have everybody close their eyes. And yesterday we had all raised our hands when we said that we had a teacher that changed our life. I want you to think of their name and think about why you immediately think of that one person. What were the characteristics? What were the feelings that you have, or sort of what do you think of when you think of that person? Now you can open your eyes. Do I have a volunteer to tell me who this person was and why that person comes up when you think of your favorite transformative teacher?
I had an English teacher in high school, Charles Cope, who really convinced me that I could write.
Empowerment, encouragement, right? These are the core themes of making a good teacher, right? So yesterday I was in a discussion talking about life skills. What does the 21st century learner need? And I think paramount to any of the soft skills that we were talking about, it is the ability to learn how to learn. That we cannot go any further without ensuring that 21st century learners, making sure that they know how to learn and can adapt to this changing world that we're coming upon. But how do you teach that? It's not something that you can do overnight. You can't just change their curriculum to actually instill that sense of learning and purpose. But it's something you can do over a period of time. But one of the things that we're looking at Solve is how do you teach how to learn within the context of learners with disabilities, learners who live in the most remote areas of the world, who are distance learners. How do you teach that to the 65 million internally displaced or refugee learners around the world? What does that mean in that context? So what we're doing is really looking at this primarily to overcome the challenge of this universal reach. We are trying to reimagine teaching and looking at how 21st century learners are responding to the current teaching curriculum and how we can maybe turn that on its head. 21st century learners are demanding new innovative ways of learning and of teaching. Our lives revolve around constantly upgrading to the newest app, the newest clothing trend, the newest TV show. Why would we believe that this behavior would be any different in the classroom? Now, I'm a firm believer in what was said early this morning. Sometimes innovation can be too much, but it is still important in my belief and in the belief of MIT Solve that innovation is at the core of solving this challenge. It's really at what not only drives the transformation of teaching, but also drives the transformation of learning. There's so much you can learn from innovating. There's so much you can do to improve innovation in the classroom and in the learning process. So we need to meet learners where they are. We need to personalize teaching. We need to figure out what drives learners and adapt that into the teaching process. So it's clear that the teaching profession is changing, and it's also clear that technology is a part of the solution, but I will say only part. I'm from MIT, and we know that technology is important. We believe in technology, but we know that it's not the sole solution. So when we think back at this example of the teachers who have impacted our lives, it is the empowerment and the encouragement that has made them memorable to us. It's not their kick-ass PowerPoint that they used. It's not the digital tools that they use necessarily. It's everything that goes around with it. So rather than us thinking that technology will usurp or replace the teaching profession, how can technology help amplify the work of teaching? And that's exactly the question that we've posed to the world for our Teachers and Educators Challenge. So we run global challenge competitions each year. We're looking for innovators around the world who are using technology in new, novel ways to solve these big challenges. We started this challenge in March. We are now sort of closing in on our July 1 deadline. We are looking for anyone, anywhere with an idea. Our youngest solver that we work with is 14. Our oldest is 84. Again, talent and ingenuity exists everywhere. We just have to tap into it. And once we select those innovators, we then work with them for over a year. We provide them seed funding, we provide them mentorship, we connect them to the resources that exist on the MIT campus, and then help them scale. And scaling is a really interesting aspect of this. So I'm going to use the example of one of our previous solvers who we selected for our Refugee Education Challenge, who happens to be a teacher, whose solution happens to be about transforming teaching within the refugee context. Her name is Katie Zanaboni, and she is a refugee educator in Bulgaria, and she was struggling. She was working in a refugee camp outside of Sofia, and she had no resources. She had no background in teaching necessarily. She was a volunteer, and she was thrown into a classroom with mixed levels of learning. She didn't speak the native languages of her students, and she said there has to be other educators out there that are working in this exact same context. What are they doing? And she couldn't find anything. There was nowhere to go. There was no sort of central place for her to look. And so she started calling up friends that she knew that were teachers, and they started sending her potential lesson plans that were based off of physical education, something that is universal, that you don't need to know the native language for. And she saw great progress in her students over the course of 6 months. And she thought, I'm going to create an online platform, something like Pinterest, that you can go on and you can select and look for different ideas and sort of pin them to board and customize them to how you like it. She came and pitched herself. She was selected. She's now, this was just purely an idea, and now she has a registered 501c3. She now went through her first round of funding. She is working with over 100 educators, not only in the Balkans, but also in Greece as well. And she is now at a point where she's ready to scale and grow. That is what we're looking for. We're looking for innovators who have these are real people with real ideas, and they have no connection to you and I in this room. And so we're trying to be that facilitator and make sure that innovation is being disseminated to the right partners around the world. So lastly, I just want to ask a question. Yesterday on the teaching panel, we saw what I call the usual suspects of when we think of this challenge of teachers and educators. Barkey Foundation has done some incredible work around the Global Teacher Prize, Teach for All,
and the Teach for All Network has done incredible work globally. But my question is, who's the next big disruptor? Who's gonna step up to the plate and make sure that teachers and educators are at the core of our thinking around education? Is it you or I in this room? Or is it gonna be someone like Katie Zanaboni who's gonna transform the world? I think all of us know that teachers are important, so I want to sort of leave that as a guiding question for our discussion of who's next? Where do we go from here? Are we always going to rely on the same players, or who will be our next big disruptor, our next big solver?
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. A very good, I think thoughts for us to think through and continue the conversation. I think what I really enjoyed is these throughout all, three of you really brought those essential life skills that we all really need, and I think that whether it's risk takers or being a lifelong learner as well as resistant and self regulators are very critical. But then we really need those teachers who are going to be encouraging and empowerment. So a very good kind of ideas and thoughts and questions. So I'd like to open the discussions to the